Good afternoon. Welcome to the Urban Technology Summit here at Cornell Tech. My name is Michael Samuelian. I'm the director of the hub here. And it is my real pleasure and honor to welcome Jigar Shah, the director of the Loan Programs Office at the U.S. Department of Energy. Jigar is joining us remotely from Washington, D.C. Welcome, Jigar. Please join me in welcoming Jigar to the summit.
Thanks for having me.
A little bit of background on Jigar. He was most recently the co-founder and president at Generate Capital, where he focused on helping entrepreneurs accelerate decarbonization solutions through the use of low-cost infrastructure as a service financing. Prior to Generate, Shah founded SunEdison, a company that pioneered pay-as-you-save solar financing. After SunEdison, Shah served as the founding CEO of the Carbon War Room, a global nonprofit founded by Sir Richard Branson at Virgin Unite to help entrepreneurs address climate change. Jigar, we have a pretty broad audience here at Cornell Tech who may not be so familiar with your office and what you do day to day. So could you briefly describe the role of your office?
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's such a joy and a pleasure to be here. I think when you think about the Loan Programs Office and why it was created, there's a certain friction, I would say, in the system, where when someone has innovated a technology and gets it to full, the technology has been proven, but it hasn't yet been commercialized. Mm-hmm. You find there's a lot of reticence by commercial banks to participate. They just don't want to be part of the first, second, third, fourth deployments of a technology. They really want it to be on the other side. And so the Loan Programs Office really does operate along this bridge to bankability behind me, which is, really we provide the commercial debt for the first commercial deployment, then the second through fifth. And then the third pillar is really around learning curve and bringing the cost down. This is the Secretary's Earthshot initiatives with hydrogen or long duration storage or now with carbon. And the fourth piece is the most difficult to explain, but really securitization, really getting Wall Street banks to take full control of the marketplace and achieve full market acceptance. And so when you think about the past of the Loan Programs Office, we've done about $35 billion of loans already. And based on our work in 2010, we were able to bridge this bankability for solar, utility scale wind, geothermal, transmission, as well as, of course, EV manufacturing with Tesla.
It's such an important role in terms of spurring innovation and really helping to accelerate kind of building new technologies here in the country. So we're coming to you, Jigar, from the campus here at Cornell Tech. Hope you can come visit us someday. It's a fantastic, very warm November day. So one of our founding principles here at Cornell, especially in our partnership with the Technion, is about commercialization of research. So coming from your standpoint, sitting in government and trying to bridge, in many ways, kind of industry and government and innovation, what do you think is the role of academia in that? And how can we help to make America a greater leader in commercialization of technology?
Well, I would say that academia is very broad, right? So I think when we think about the research part of technology, I still think that we need to be very bold in the risk-taking that we take. And we should figure out a way to move to allowing for more failure, right? And the DOE should be providing a lot more grants to people to come up with, non-conventional approaches that will eventually, over time, bring us to the next level of innovation. So that part, I think, is very important. But the other part of academia, as you know, is commercial acceptance of technology, right? Some of that is based on commercialization models, right? So one of them, of course, is the power purchase agreement that I had helped popularize with solar. But others are, should we be doing government mandates for these things, right? What is an approach that is uniquely American to commercialization? You can imagine that the Chinese have an approach that people describe regularly. The Canadians and the Germans have an approach people describe regularly, but what is the uniquely American approach to commercialization? I would venture to say that government supports private sector capital formation. So the capital markets have to find where they want to put $100 billion of capital, because that's really what it takes to commercialize infrastructure. And if they don't want to put $100 billion into something, well, then it doesn't matter how many tax credits we provided the government or how many low interest loans or other things, you don't get there. I'll give you an example of where we haven't seen traction is in places like low impact hydro, right? We've known that there are $65 billion worth of old dams from the 1920s that can be upgraded to be able to meet these current needs, but you don't see a lot of interest, even though the tax credits have been in place for a long time, some of the other support mechanisms. And so I think it's important for academics to opine on whether our ability to commercialize our technology is due to a lack of government tools, or whether it's a lack of using those tools appropriately, or whether we're just not aligned with the private sector.
Yeah, so do you see, just to pivot for a second, the role of kind of carrots and sticks from a kind of a regulatory standpoint as well in terms of spurring innovation? And if tax credits really aren't necessarily going to be doing the job, do you see kind of your office in terms of just providing direct capital as that mechanism?
Yeah, I mean, tax credits only work if you have a commercial bank that's willing to provide the money, right? And then the tax credits just make the economics a little bit better. And so we really insert ourselves in places where there is a lack of liquidity, right? That there's a lot of technologies that have actually reached all the milestones and they can prove it to us, which is why we give them money. But a commercial bank often says, I don't really need to do something new or different to meet my numbers for the year, right? I mean, this just seems like a lot of work. I'd have to write 5 white papers. I'd have to educate the investment committee on a new asset class that we've never done before. I don't want to do that, right? So it's not that your project is too risky for them. They just don't want to make the effort to do that. And so we see this time and time again, and that's where the Loan Programs Office has a responsibility to insert itself, to be able to make sure that these entrepreneurs really get the funding that they need to get onto that bridge to bankability.
Yeah, and it's so important thinking about the role of industry in terms of supporting innovation. But shifting a bit to maybe our home turf, or a little bit far from our home turf right now, the city of Ithaca just announced a plan to begin a full decarbonization effort with the goal of becoming carbon neutral by 2030, a very aggressive goal even for a relatively small city. But it triggers the question of what do you think is the role of local government? I know you're sitting at the kind of federal level, but you've had such a broad career. What do you think the role of cities are in terms of kind of spurring decarbonization and some of our energy challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think it shows the different approaches to succeeding. I mean, I think fundamentally, local government is the key to succeeding in decarbonization, right? To be clear, right? Whether it's a local government that has an old coal plant or natural gas plant that needs to be repowered, or whether it's New York City that passed Local Law 97 to try to push people to deploy common sense, cost-effective techniques that have been sort of sitting on the shelf for 20 years, or whether it's Ithaca that's taking a more bold approach to converting folks to heat pumps and other technologies. I think we all acknowledge a few things, right? One is that the technology has existed for 20 years to do this. So none of this is actually enabled by groundbreaking technology. There may be some groundbreaking innovations that were enablers. Like, for instance, the fact that cell phone coverage is so cheap today allows you to evacuate some of the data from the homes into a central database that allows you to manage the grid more efficiently today, which maybe you couldn't have done 20 years ago cost effectively because cell phone technology was more expensive, or sensors were more expensive 20 years ago than they are today, right? So there's lots of things that may be enabling, but the core technology has been around for a long time, whether it's EVs or EV chargers or other things. And so now the question really becomes, what tools do local government have, right? So they have licensure tools, right? They can determine who gets to work in their city and who doesn't get to work in their city. They have the ability to opt into green bank things, and so they can try to provide beneficial financing for people who live in their community who may not have the liquidity to immediately pay cash for a new refrigerator or water heater or other things that break. They may also be able to move to alternative business models, right? I mean, Ithaca has a fairly robust transit agency. That transit agency to date has not been a part of the passenger vehicle movement, but they could, right? The transit agency has a whole bunch of parking lots that have the ability to host EV chargers. And when you look at what Hertz just announced with Tesla, there are a lot of rental car agencies that would be happy to partner with Ithaca and their transit agencies to say, hey, we're going to put 20 electric vehicles in these lots, and people are going to be able to rent them by the week so they don't get screwed over by folks who are doing subprime auto loans. And so there are many ways for cities to engage, but they have to understand where their risk appetite is, and what level of expertise they have available locally to be able to implement these fairly complex programs.
Mm-hmm. And so since we're sitting here in a room of researchers, students, we have a lot of urban tech students here, which always makes me happy. So what should we be working on? What are some of the kind of tricky problems that you think that we should be putting some of our attention on when it comes to kind of helping to, as you said, finding those technologies that really kind of enable a cleaner grid, enable a less carbon in terms of our power generation and our daily life?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and one that isn't really straightforward to answer. I think I think that there are people who have different persuasions, right? I think traditionally technology has been defined by folks who invent something brand new, right? Invent a new battery chemistry, invent a new approach to robotics, or whatever it is, right? I think there's another whole class of innovation that's coming about that really is around solving problems and saying to people, like, you have a sphere of influence. Why don't your parents decarbonize? They certainly say they want to decarbonize, but then the next car they buy is another, SUV that runs on gasoline, right? Or, why don't people put solar on their roofs when it's clearly very cost effective in many places around the country, right? Why don't people, tear up their lawns? Lawns are clearly terrible for the planet and for your budget, right? Why wouldn't you just let it go natural, grow vegetables in your front yard, do something other than pay $3,000 a year to take care of your lawn, right? There's lots of things that people do, and the question then becomes for researchers, well, why don't they move, right? Is it an information gap, right? Is there something I can solve with an information gap? Is it the way in which the buying process works? And that's actually one of the big challenges. It's the way in which the user interface and some of the other things work. Like, for instance, there are many homes in Ithaca that will not really be able to move seamlessly to electrify everything because they have 100 amp service in their house. Well, there's a new announcement made by Span.io on October 28th that shows that instead of upgrading the service to the house, they can actually replace the breaker panel with a smart panel. And the smart panel can make sure that the house never draws more than 100 amps, but still allows you to go to a heat pump, allows you to have electric vehicles, allows you to do all those things. But it just balances the loads in your house in a way that's seamless to you, but saves thousands of dollars of upgrading the grid to be able to serve your home in this electrify everything movement. So that's also an innovation, right? And so I think when you think about innovation, you think about all across the spectrum, and then you've got sector, right? Like, you've got everything from batteries to hydrogen to chemicals and plastics to carbon sequestration and storage and other things that we're doing.
No, I love that. I mean, one of the things that we've been talking about over the past couple of days is certainly optimization and the role of optimization in urban systems. And in many ways, as you pointed out, these inefficiencies of the market are the opportunities for technology to kind of find, those solutions that kind of help spur greater adoption of the tech to make a cleaner grid and less carbon, and really help kind of propel us to a whole nother level of thinking. Taking a bit of a pivot.
One of my colleagues called it breakthrough deployment instead of breakthrough innovation.
I love that. That's great. We have something here called breakthrough tech, which is more about getting more women into technology. But I like breakthrough deployment as well. Getting a little bit more global to go from the local to the global, because cities can only do so much in the end, but it really takes, I mean, greenhouse gases no boundaries in terms of countries. So COP26 just concluded. Not sure if you were following it or not, but any big takeaways for innovation, and how about the core of kind of scaling technologies to help us kind of achieve some of these climate goals?
Yeah, it's a good question. And let me answer the question a couple of different ways, right? The first is I would say that one of the things that came out of COP is that everything really is local, right? And so I think we want to make sure that we understand that like governments cannot solve this problem. We have 19,200 cities and towns in this country. There are way more than 19,200 activists who care about climate change. You're engaging with your local community and doing the hard work to figuring out how to convince people at the local level that this really is the largest wealth creation opportunity of our lifetime, and that their town should opt into that wealth creation, right? Remember, if Ithaca pulls this off, not only will Ithaca have benefited it's the people that live in that town and the contractors and the air quality and all those things, but those people are going to be the ones who export that know-how to all the surrounding towns who are slow, right? And that wealth will stay in Ithaca, right? And so when you think about this, it really is local implementation that is the challenge, and it is where people need to spend their most effort and time to do that. The other thing, though, that came out of COP was, when you look at the International Energy Agency and all the work that they did over the last 3 years, they've identified over 400 technologies that are necessary to decarbonize the planet by 2050. And the good news is they recognize that all of those technologies are proven at lab scale. And some of them are even proven at pre-production pilot scale. And so when you think about where we are from a technology standpoint, they confirmed at COP this year that we have the vast majority of technologies invented already to meet our 2035 and 2050 goals, right? And that is a really big deal, because I would say even up until the Paris Agreement in 2015, remember the big takeaway out of Paris was mission innovation and how we need to invest more in innovation. I continue to believe we need to invest more in innovation today. So don't get me wrong. 2050 is not an endpoint. We still need to, optimize for 2100 and years after that. But the focus on really deploying capital, really deploying technology, really, creating millions of jobs is, I think, what really came out of COP.
Mm-hmm. So I take it you were pretty optimistic coming out of it this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you can't not be optimistic, right? Ultimately, like the human species has been around for some time, and we're always faced with some large emergency, and we've always used innovation and ingenuity to be able to get to the other side of it.
So going now within technology at the DOE, you must see a lot of proposals for all sorts of different technologies. Can you talk about some of the ways that DOE uses technology to help shape and evaluate proposals?
Use technology to evaluate proposals?
Yeah, well, which technologies are you excited about that when you see a proposal?
Yeah, so I guess what I would say is that there's a lot of collaboration going on today in ways that I think were not necessarily fully envisioned by the mainstream media. So for instance, 12 came out with sustainable aviation fuels made out of carbon dioxide. For all the people who are pro-sustainable aviation fuels and the anti-carbon dioxide removal, I think, they were like, wait a second, our two worlds are colliding. So there's a lot of good stuff happening there. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening with coal, where coal happens to have a lot of rare earths and important critical minerals within the coal. And so instead of burning the coal, there are ways of mining the coal to actually separate these critical minerals and rare earths and others from those, so that we can create batteries and other things that we want to create. I think on the nuclear front, I think people have allowed themselves to get very dismayed on nuclear. And I think what you will find in this next crop of nuclear technologies is that they are far safer than the previous versions that we had, and able to be manufactured in a mass manufacturing way, just like you do offshore wind turbines in a factory. And so you can largely build airplanes, not airports, with nuclear. So I think you're going to see nuclear play a big role by 2035 and 2050 in our decarbonization efforts with the new technologies coming out there. And then the last area that I would focus on is hydrogen, and the amount of breakthroughs there are really breathtaking. And remember, we spent a lot of money on hydrogen research under the George W. Bush administration, the first, hydrogen initiatives back then. But what's interesting about hydrogen is once you accomplish getting to cheap hydrogen, then you end up with a very clear pathway to getting cheap decarbonized chemicals, cheap decarbonized plastics, and many other sectors, right? So hydrogen is really a gateway, less, I would say, for transportation and a lot more for all these other decarbonization efforts throughout the economy.
Going back, that nuclear comment was interesting to me. We had a presentation yesterday about New York State getting carbon neutral by 2050, and as you probably know, New York State is a pretty significant nuclear component to our grid, but there's certainly a cultural gating issue with it. So any thoughts on how you kind of get beyond that? I mean, when we have a lot of foreign or international students who they find it mind-boggling that in the U.S. we don't focus on nuclear, or it is almost like a dirty word. Do you think it's purely cultural? Do you think there's this technological fix that you pointed out that will just make it seem safer to people?
It's a great question, and one that doesn't have an easy answer. I think the conventional wisdom is that it's Greenpeace's fault. I don't think that that's actually true, but having been on the board of Greenpeace for 6 years. But I would say that there's a couple of things. One is that this is a global phenomenon. It's not a US phenomenon, right? Japan today continues to be anti-nuclear, even though Fukushima really showed how resilient nuclear technology really is. Like when something that was really largely unthinkable occurred there, it held up really well. And it's found out later that there were some issues in the way in which that project was commissioned. And many of the other nuclear power plants in that same row who were affected by tsunamis weren't shut down. So I think that when you think about the safety record of nuclear, it's really unparalleled. Even solar and wind are slightly less safe than nuclear. Not by much, but slightly less safe. I'd say the other piece of it is we shouldn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So while it's clear that nobody in politically important circles seems to want Indian Point to operate, there are many other nuclear plants throughout New York State that are operating today. And there are many old coal plant sites or natural gas plant sites in New York State that are ideal for conversion to small modular reactors. And there are many small towns in New York that are attracting these small modular reactors to their towns because they want the economic development that comes out of it, as well as all of the power plant workers that would work there. And so this is why I was saying earlier that all of this is really local. And when we talk about the United States, we shouldn't talk about it as the United States in the same way that we don't talk about Europe as Europe. We talk about Europe as France or Germany or other places. I think what happens in different states and then different regions within that states are different. And what's important is to note that actually reaching our decarbonization goals can largely be done by converting a lot of these coal and natural gas plants to small modular reactors, right? And so we don't actually need to go into greenfield locations to do this. Even if you just took the existing coal footprint that we have that has already been announced to be shut down, as well as the 1990s era natural gas plants that are also being shut down, those interconnections, those 1,800 acres of land around it, and those communities all want power generation to be part of their economic development story for the next 50 years.
So Finally, and you may have already answered this, maybe as long as it's not nuclear, but what's getting you excited about the future? And then what overall advice would you give to our community of academics, government officials, industry representatives about how to support the country in terms of supporting our goals around innovation, commercialization, and ultimately decarbonization?
I think for the last 40 years, and I would say this applies to nuclear as well, we really did a lot of great work on the innovation side, but we didn't do a lot of great work on the deployment side. And then we ended up saying to ourselves, well, the monopoly utility companies are in the way, the Public Service Commission is in the way, the governor's office doesn't care, that this innovation isn't happening because the powers that be don't really want it to occur. And I think what's happened today is that we have recognized that actually the powers that be didn't really understand what the deployment trajectory really was. Like, how does this work? When solar was at 17 cents a kilowatt hour in 2008, no one could fathom that it could come down to 3 cents, right? Like, I remember I was there talking to everybody saying it was going to come down to 3 cents and had it in my model that it was going to come to 3 cents, but people didn't believe me. Even Secretary Moniz didn't believe me, right? Who's one of the smartest people on the planet, right? And so I think that there's a renewed thought process amongst people around the learning curve and how predictable the learning curve really is. That when you install, 7 generations of a product, that you really do get a cumulative doubling. You get a reduction in cost for every cumulative doubling of experience. And that is built into the Secretary's Earthshot programs, right? So when you think about the hydrogen Earthshot or the carbon negative Earthshot or the long duration Earthshot, the DOE believes pretty strongly that those numbers are going to get hit. They didn't just throw out a number because they thought it was interesting. Like, the Secretary really held them to account and said, are you really going to hit these numbers? And they said, yeah, we think we can hit these numbers because of the learning curve effects and the innovation that's in their pipeline. And so part of what I would shift your question to a little bit is, I think that there is greater understanding and greater coordination now amongst the federal government, local government, state government, and innovators around what it means to build the first of a kind solution, what it means and the applied engineering that's required there, which frankly has been lacking for a long time in our country. But bringing that back, and then how to reduce the cost of these installations through engineering, procurement, and construction optimization. And then how to bring down the costs over time through 7 cumulative doublings of experience. And then how to get Wall Street to bring in huge amounts of low-cost capital, which is what you see with solar today, into the space. That commercialization pathway that is uniquely American is something that I don't think that everybody was bought into. But today, I think they are increasingly bought into it, and that gives more hope to innovators, entrepreneurs, academics, right? Because if you know that this is the pathway to commercialization, it makes it easier to invest in early stage innovation and early stage effort, because you know that there's actually a way to bring those all the way through the commercialization cycle.
Now, that's incredibly inspirational and great for our audience, and almost feels like a commercial for Cornell Tech, because we are a place that tries to bring together innovators and engineers and really kind of building a pipeline of engineering talent along with entrepreneurialism. So this has been incredibly inspirational to me. Any closing words for our audience before we let you go?
As the Secretary likes to say, deploy, deploy, deploy.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Jigar Shah for joining us today.